There is a city that appears on the maps, and then simply does not. Not the way cities typically vanish, through fire, through conquest, through deserts slowly reclaiming what people once built. This disappearance is different. Chilaga does not fall, it does not burn. It is simply no longer recorded. I have been sitting with this question longer than I am comfortable admitting. I am not someone who reaches quickly for the word erased. That word carries weight. It implies intention. Intention implies an agent, and naming agents without evidence is precisely where careful thinking collapses into something considerably less disciplined. So let me be honest from the beginning. I am not going to tell you I have solved anything, because I have not. What I am going to do is lay out what survives in the record, what is absent from it, and what the shape of that absence looks like when you stand far enough back to see it whole. The standard historical account of Tartaria, the vast geographic label that European cartographers applied to the enormous stretch of land between the Caspian Sea and the Pacific, is actually quite reasonable on its face. European mapmakers were working with limited second-hand information, often filtered through multiple languages and layers of accumulated report. Their maps of Central Asia and Siberia were composites, traders' accounts, missionary dispatches, royal correspondence relayed across distances that distorted detail at every step. A city appearing in one generation of maps and vanishing from the next does not, by itself, demand a sinister explanation. Maps of that era were not accurate documents in any modern sense. They were accumulations of inference. Abraham Ortelius, whose 1570 Theatrum Orbis Terrarum became the most widely referenced atlas of its era, freely acknowledged that his information on Asia's interior was fragmentary. Gerard Mercator, whose projection transformed how Europe visualized the globe, drew Tartaria's cities largely from accounts filtered through multiple translations and intermediaries. These are not criticisms. These are admissions by the cartographers themselves. When Chilaga appears on certain 16th and 17th century maps of Greater Tartary, labelled with apparent substance, positioned near river systems that would have supported settlement, and then quietly disappears over the course of the 18th century, the mainstream explanation is simple. The cartographers were correcting their errors. The name was a misplacement, a mistranslation, or a fiction borrowed from unreliable oral accounts. As surveys improved, the error was silently dropped. The map got better. The ghost city fell away. That is a tidy explanation, and for a long time I was prepared to accept it. Here is where it becomes less tidy. Philipp Johann von Strahlenberg was a Swedish officer captured by Russian forces at the Battle of Poltava in 1709. He spent the following 13 years, not in any prison, but travelling through Siberia and the territories Europeans still called Tartaria, conducting what amounted to a systematic field survey of the region. When he returned to Europe, he published his findings in 1730, a methodical, cautious, empirically grounded work that historians still cite. His descriptions of geography, trade routes, and settlement patterns across the Siberian interior are among the more reliable European accounts of that territory produced before Russian imperial surveys came to dominate the field. In that 1730 account, you find descriptions of the Siberian interior that resist easy categorization, among them ancient earthworks and ruins of uncertain origin, along with interior trade routes whose terminus he could not attribute to any currently active settlement. He recorded these features with care. He attached no city name to the locations involved. I want to hold this detail carefully and not overload it. A Swedish officer notes convergent trade infrastructure in an area where a city name used to appear and then stopped appearing. That is not proof of anything, but it is a data point that the correcting an inaccuracy explanation does not cleanly absorb. The cartographic history of Tartaria's interior is, if you spend enough time with it, a strange document of progressive silence rather than progressive correction. This distinction matters. When maps genuinely improve, cities that were wrongly placed get moved. Cities wrongly named get renamed. Errors of inference tend to leave traces of themselves in the revision. What happens to Chilaga is not that. The name appears across maps that seem to draw from multiple independent source traditions rather than a single account propagated through copying. Then, across the transition from the 17th to the 18th century, precisely the period when Russian surveys were actively updating European geographic knowledge, the name simply stops, not corrected, not annotated, simply absent. Johann Georg Mellin, the German naturalist who surveyed Siberia extensively for the Russian Academy of Sciences from 1733 to 1743, produced scientific journals that historians treat as foundational documents of the region. In those journals, he describes ruins in areas he found inexplicable, structures unattributable to any civilization he could identify. He did not connect these ruins to any name. He catalogued them, noted their anomalous presence, and moved forward in his survey. But the regions he described sit within the general territory where Chilaga once appeared on maps, drawn by men who had no professional incentive to invent a city in that otherwise unremarkable stretch of geography. You are now carrying 3 separate observations from 3 sources spanning nearly 2 centuries, a name with apparent independent attestation across cartographic traditions, a Swedish officer noting living infrastructure pointing toward a nameless interior location, and a German naturalist noting inexplicable ruins in the same territory. None of these men were in conversation with each other about this. Consider what it means for 3 independent sources to converge on the same absence. Strahlenberg was a military officer drawing on direct field observation. Gmelin was a naturalist working within empirical science. The cartographers who recorded the name were drawing on compiled geographic reports. These are not the same tradition, not the same method, not the same era. When sources with different methods, different interests, and different intellectual frameworks all point toward the same general location and the same general quality of silence, that is not the same as one account being copied through many hands. That is something that deserves a different kind of scrutiny than we have collectively been willing to give it. None of these men were building a case. They were documenting what they encountered. And what they encountered keeps pointing at the same silence on the map. That is not coincidence. It is also not proof. It is a pattern. And patterns require explanation before they can be honestly dismissed. Let me pause and address the obvious counter-argument, because it is a fair one and deserves genuine engagement. Russian imperial expansion into Siberia was characterized by real administrative ambition and geographic assertiveness. The empire was actively surveying its new territories, absorbing local geographic knowledge into its own framework, and occasionally suppressing information it deemed strategically sensitive. This is documented history. Russian imperial geography was not disinterested science. So is the explanation simply that administrators, updating European maps through their own surveys, systematically removed names that competed with their geographic authority. That Chilaga was absorbed into Russian administrative naming under a different designation, the older Tartarian label quietly dropped. That explanation is rational. Empires rename things. They always have. The British renamed half of India. The Spanish renamed half of the Americas. A Russian imperial survey absorbing a place that European cartographers had been calling Chilaga into some other administrative category would not be remarkable. It would be exactly what imperial geographies routinely do. But here is what that explanation requires you to accept: that Russian geographic surveys, which were meticulous about documenting existing settlements, including small ones, ruined ones, nomadic ones, found nothing at those coordinates warranting preservation under any name at all. Not a notation of prior habitation, not a ruin marker, simply nothing. The men who conducted those surveys were not careless. Imperial geographic surveys were instruments of administrative control. They documented everything because knowing what was in the territory was the precondition of governing it. Omissions were unusual. A systematic omission focused on a specific region in surveys of otherwise exhaustive character is harder to explain away. I want to be precise about what I am not saying. I am not saying that a specific administrator made a decision in a specific room to erase Chilaga from the record. I genuinely do not believe that is what happened. What I am suggesting is something more structurally uncomfortable than a named conspiracy. Institutions, when they share a common interest in a particular geographic narrative, do not require central coordination to produce uniform results. Russian imperial cartography, European academic geography, and the emerging professional historical establishment of the 18th century all had overlapping reasons to prefer a clean map, one that told a coherent story of progressive discovery, not one that raised inconvenient questions about what had existed in the interior before the expansion reached it. That shared interest, operating independently across multiple institutions and multiple decades, can produce something functionally indistinguishable from coordinated suppression, without anyone in any room ever having made a deliberate decision to suppress anything. And when institutional forgetting operates at that scale, across cartographic, academic, and administrative channels simultaneously, the result looks, from the outside, indistinguishable from coordinated erasure. But there is no edict, no sealed archive, only the convergence of preference doing the work that intention would have done, invisibly and without any single architect. If anything, that is more unsettling than a conspiracy, because it means no one is accountable. No single archive holds the missing evidence, and the mechanism of forgetting is not malice, but the quiet, efficient operation of institutional incentive. The silence organized itself. That is harder to confront than a villain would be. I need to stop here and name the weaknesses in my own argument, because intellectual honesty requires it. The fact that multiple independent sources describe ruins or converging infrastructure in a region does not establish that those sources are describing the same site, or that any of it connects to a single location with a single name. Siberia is enormous. Ruins of varied origins, Scythian, Seongdo, Turkic, medieval, are scattered across exactly the regions we are discussing, and archaeologists have studied and attributed many of them to known cultures. It is entirely possible that what Strahlenberg observed and what Gamelin catalogued were remnants of one or several of these civilizations. The name Chilaga may itself be a local oral term that European cartographers mistranslated upward into the concept of a permanent city, a regional descriptor, an imprecise reference to a site that meant something to local populations, but did not correspond to anything the maps implied, when they placed it at specific coordinates. Maps in that era copied each other. A name that enters the record through one unreliable source will propagate through subsequent editions, giving the illusion of independent attestation when the attestation is really just one original account multiplied. I hold this possibility seriously. It is plausible. It would explain much of what I have described. But there is one element that this explanation does not cleanly resolve, and that is the question of the routes. Trade routes in the early modern period were not abstract features on paper. They were physical infrastructure, paths worn by sustained use, river crossings maintained by ongoing traffic, waypoints where goods regularly changed hands. Strahlenberg's observation of converging routes in the interior was not an observation about ruins. It was an observation about living, active infrastructure pointing toward locations that had no active population center to justify their maintenance. Where were those routes going? That question has not received a satisfying answer in the historical literature I have examined. I have looked carefully, though not exhaustively, through the scholarship on Siberian trade geography in the early modern period. The silence around that particular question is not the silence of something examined and set aside. It is the silence of something that has not been seriously looked at. Those are not the same kind of silence. What I keep returning to is this. The history of European geographic knowledge is full of cities that were real and forgotten, cities that were imagined and believed, and cities that occupied some ambiguous territory between those two categories. Chilaga may be any of these. I cannot tell you with certainty which one fits. What I can tell you is that the process by which it left the maps does not look like the process by which cartographic errors are corrected. It looks like something else, something I do not have a precise word for. Not suppression exactly, not conspiracy, something more like institutional forgetting under the pressure of narrative convenience. The Russian Empire was building a geographic story of open land discovered and settled by its expanding frontier. European academics were building a narrative of rational cartographic improvement. Neither framework had a comfortable place for a city in the interior of Tartaria that did not fit the account of what had been there before, and so, through no single decision and no single hand, the space on the map where Chilaga appeared was allowed to become smooth, undifferentiated, unnamed. Not because anyone chose to forget it, because every institutional incentive pointed away from remembering and nothing pointed toward it with sufficient force to resist that pressure. I want to be careful not to claim more than the evidence supports. Even if something real existed at those coordinates that the maps were imperfectly recording, that does not mean what was there was large or advanced or outside the range of what we already know about human history in that region. The elaborate theories about Tartarian civilization that circulate in certain communities are built on foundations considerably thinner than what I have described here, and I am not capable of building that structure honestly. That is not what this is. I am not telling you that Chilaga was a lost empire. I am not equipped to tell you that, but I am also not willing to close the question, because the convergence of independent accounts, the persistence of the name across maps with apparently distinct source traditions, the living infrastructure Strahlenberg observed pointing toward coordinates that the subsequent record refuses to acknowledge, these details do not dissolve when I press on them. Historiography has a systematic bias toward the documented, which is not the same as a bias toward the real. Things that were real but left sparse documentation get filtered out of the record not by malice but by methodology. The filter is not a conspiracy. but its effects on what we choose to remember are not neutral. They hold their shape, and things that hold their shape under sustained pressure deserve more careful attention than the historical record, as it currently stands, has been willing to give them. That is not a conspiracy claim. That is a methodological one. The question has not been examined. It has been skipped. There is something at those coordinates. I do not know what it is. I do not know whether what the maps called Chilaga ever corresponded to anything that deserved a name of its own, or whether the name was always a misunderstanding that survived in the documentary record through the ordinary mechanics of cartographic inheritance. What I know is that the silence around that location is not a natural silence. Natural silences are shapeless. They spread evenly, they cover everything they touch without discrimination. This one has edges, and edges mean something was there to create them. I do not know what to do with that, but I cannot unknow it.